Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Daniel Estulin. Welcome to Estulin.media. Today, well, we brought back by popular demand an old friend of mine. His name was Dyer. Did I pronounce your last name right?
Yeah, Dyer. That's good.
Okay, and well, we've had him on. He's many different things. He's an investigative journalist. He's an investigator. He's an analyst. He's an expert on. I don't want to say esoteric knowledge because you're an expert on so many different areas of the kinds of things that we really like to understand how the world really works. And one of the things we're going to be talking to you today about is the Vatican. So, Jay, first of all, thank you so much for joining us and finding the time to be with us.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm glad to be here. Of course, you've had seminal texts that were very instrumental in my waking process. I remember reading Bilderberg Group many years ago and reading Tavistock, and then you've got your transhumanist text. So thank you for all the great material you put out.
That's the transhumanist. I remember when my book came out in Spain. Before it came out in the States, it came out in Spain, and my publisher was saying to me, all the stuff he's talking about, that's going to be like 100 years from now. And I said to her, Laura, because I write in English, and of course I have to translate before it's published like 6 months later. I said, I'm going to make a prediction 6 months from now when the book is actually released in Spanish, half at least of the things I talk about in my book will have actually happened. He said, absolutely no way out of the question. And it's like, holy Maloney.
Yeah, right.
It actually did happen.
It is. It's rolling out really quick, isn't it? I mean, your book was way ahead of time.
Yeah, well, you have amazing books in your own that I've read, needless to say, and I love them. We're going to talk about it at the end of the interview so people can actually follow your work, which I think is very important for general understanding of how things work. So let's kind of roll with this. Let's start with the Vatican. I saw an interview of yours, the first part. I didn't get a chance to see the second part. Fascinating. I can't remember the guy's name. It was a wonderful interview. So I want to ask you a few different questions. Where would you place Vatican on the pecking order of this global elite?
That is a good question, and it's difficult because a lot of people, we how do we value things like the Vatican? How do we value, these giant churches? So it's hard to say in terms of monetary value, but it seems to be the case that in the 20th century, the Vatican kind of took a backseat to the Western, power structure, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, and that seems to be due to a lot of Cold War blackmail deals that were made, particularly under the period of Pius XII with William Colby, the CIA, and that was to funnel a lot of money into the Vatican Bank. So it seems like around the mid 20th century, and then we get a really strong uptick in CIA involvement in what they call the doctrinal warfare program that David Wemhoff writes a big, excellent book about. So I would say that maybe in older time periods, Renaissance, something like this, you could have a lot more geopolitical power for the papacy. But I'd say nowadays they seem kind of an adjunct, kind of subservient to the Western intelligence power structure.
Because again, when we talk about the intelligence, Union Sancto, of course, was the very first intelligence apparatus in the world.
Right.
Then you have the special intelligence service, the British, but the Vatican was first. You mentioned the deep state. Okay, so let's roll with that. So, for example, if we're talking about the deep state in America, we know who controls the White House, who controls Joe Biden. Okay, we understand how that kind of stuff. But do you think there's a deep state within the Vatican itself? And if there is, who runs it?
Yeah, I think the key to understanding that would be this time period when what we call P2 or organized crime was able to essentially have the highest level cardinals and archbishops and people not just in the Vatican, but also in Italy, signed on to this kind of, as we said, secret power structure set up by Kissinger and all these figures from the CIA, Theodore Shackley, and all these guys who were really black ops people who were looking for new ways to fund, international operations, black operations, which you wrote about in Shadow Masters. I forgot to mention Shadow Masters. You had a lot of really good insights into that about these structures, how the drug, cartels, this kind of stuff, that funds a lot of these black ops, and it actually props up the global economy to a degree most people don't know. So I think that that would be where I would look, would be to the time period of Gladio and the P2 Mafia that really seemed to, because that was a tie-in between organized crime post-World War II, where you have these essentially Mussolini had booted out the Freemasons, but then they come back after World War II, and the CIA makes this deal between Licio Gelli, Michelson, Dona, and all these figures who are organized crime guys to run this secret government in Italy. So that's just one example of how the structure of a government within a government works. And it usually ties into secret societies and intelligence networks, as you know. So I would say that's really the key window that we have into how that works. And it's the same model of how they do things in America. And the key for that is the British intelligence structure that set up the OSS and the CIA, right? You had all these the British intelligence guys that come over. You have William Stevenson from Canada, and who had an office at Rockefeller Plaza. You've got, you've got Ian Fleming, Noel Coward, all those guys. They essentially consult and explain how to set this up for with Bill Donovan, and then that becomes America's kind of secret government, in my view. And that same model of secret government is the same model that's used in Gladio in Italy. But that model, that technique is kind of, in my view, is kind of, they use that same kind of.
Gladio, yeah, because again, for our audience, we are talking about a lot of different pieces of the puzzle. So we started with the Vatican, but Jay's talking about Gladio, P2 Propaganda Due, that's the Masonic Lodge in Italy. We're talking about the OSS structures post-World War II. We're talking about the Italian Mafia. We're talking about the drone running operation. We're talking about all of these little things. So let's break it up for the people, because a lot of them, people understand, they know, because again, those who read and follow what I do, what you do, they understand. But still, let's put it together. Let's start with the Gladio. What was Gladio? And how does it fit into the World War II or post-World War II, these power structures, secret power structures?
Well, after World War II, the new global threat becomes the idea of a Soviet takeover of Europe. And this is where we get, NATO. This is where we get all of these structures post-World War II. And the idea was, in case of a Soviet invasion of Europe, we want to have secret armies in place. And so this is the idea of training people in secret as in a cell model in different countries. And it turns out, according to Daniel Ganser's PhD thesis, that it was all over Europe and even in Latin South America in terms of the model of how they did it. So this was dreamt up, as we said, by the same sorts of CIA people that would make the contact with the organized crime factions in Italy. And the reason I was talking about Italy and Gladio is because that's a window into this secret government structure in Italy, and how it tied into, and really, in my view, kind of ultimately co-opted the Vatican through Vatican banking deals. And so probably a lot of people have heard of that Roberto Calvi and the P2, that Vatican bank scandal where he ends up dead. That is this same model and structure. That's a window into how this deep state structure works. So it's a government within a government. And in my view, if we go back and we study the Rhodes, Rothschild, Milner inner circles of government, how they ran the British Empire, it's the same model. It's just exported to different countries. So Gladio is just one operation that some writers, there was a guy named David Yallop, he wrote a book in 1985, and he didn't even know, they didn't know what Gladio was at that time. So it was still a secret operation, but he stumbled on this structure, and he just talked about it being behind terror events like the Bologna bombing in 1982. It was behind assassinations and these kinds of things, and really just running a lot of false flag terror operations to blame Soviets, to blame communists, that then would give credence to the existing power structure, to the Vatican, to the CIA operations. And I'm not saying that makes communists good, or that it makes the West.
It's not about that. It's about
exactly. Yeah, you know. I just always say this because
it's about putting the pieces together. So Gladio was a front for Propaganda Due, but was P2 the real power behind the throne in Italy, and by extension in Europe?
It would seem so, because they had according to some of the texts and analyzed it, you basically had this secret society structured in Italy like a pyramid. And you had people recruited into it, and then they would be compromised at various parties. Where have we heard of this, right? This is
this is the foreshadowing of the Epstein.
Exactly.
Going back to the 1980s.
Yeah, and it's the same structure of the Franklin scandal with how Craig Spence would film people at the parties of the GOP.
That book was written by a friend of mine, Nick Bryant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Franklin cover-up books, exactly.
Yeah.
And you find that same pattern there of compromising. And then, so then when they get compromised, they say, all right, you join our group, or we expose you, or we, do something worse to you. So it's kind of like you can be a part of the structure, or you lose everything, right? So it's a zero sum game, I guess. That's not much of a choice there.
What I found over the years is that looking into this, no matter how you look at this thing, there's always sovereign military and small and hospitality order of St. John. So if you kind of from the outside, you look at it from the outside in, it's the Anglo-American syndicate structures. Correct. And whenever one turns in investigating, whether it's Propaganda Louis or Gladio, the Black Nobility, International Terrorism, or Nazi International, you always come up against SMOM, Sovereign Military and Hospitality Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes and Malta, known as the Knights of St. Malta, known as Knights of Malta. And they were omnipresent in the establishment of these financial and I guess human infrastructures of modern international terrorism already during World War II and immediately after. And so you have these, members of Knights of Malta, such as Baron Luigi Palilli, that's Venetian Black nobility, industrialists with high-level connections to both Hitler's SS, and also to Mussolini's intelligence services, and also to the Vatican structures, and also the main liaison between SS General Karl Wolff and Allen Dulles when he was in Bern. Remember that Dulles was a point man behind the scenes dealing with U.S. industrialization and also the Third Reich, money laundering, high-level connections, weapon smuggling until 1942, at least early 43. And Dulles was, of course, a Rockefeller man, and Rockefeller clan were one of the key money makers and also the Nazi liaisons during the war. And of course, you needed a lot of money to maintain this Gladio network. And the question is, where did these people get their money from? Because again, Vatican had to participate. You said it earlier, when we started the interview, you're talking about the blackmail. So they must have been blackmailed. What do you think?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So this pyramid I was talking about, and this is just in Italy, right? So you get a lot of prelates, you get government officials, you get Italian military intelligence. They're invited to parties. They're compromised. And then at the top of this pyramid structure of the P2, particularly in Italy, you had a figure named Licio Gelli. And Licio Gelli is one of these guys who's knighted, like you said. And the irony, of course, is that he's an atheist, but he's knighted by the Pope, given these gifts, much like we saw the figure of Jimmy Savile is knighted as well, papal knighthood, but has no interest. In fact, he seems to have been an outright Satanist, had no interest in Roman Catholicism. So we start to notice this pattern of really important people getting knighted and brought into Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Knights Hospitaller, all these kinds of old orders that you talk about that have these dubious medieval origins, but are really just covers for, as you said, intelligence operations and black ops and all sorts of nefarious activities. So you absolutely nailed it there. And the reason I brought up this pyramid is because in Paul Williams' book, he describes it that this figure of Licio Gelli was here. And then he says that who was really running P2 was people in the U.S. like Kissinger and these kinds of figures. And so he said it was like this at the top, and then it's right here. So it's basically an X, right, with two pyramids. And so the figure between the P2 and Kissinger and those guys in the U.S. is Licio Gelli. So basically Kissinger and Theodore Shackley and all these intelligence operatives are telling Gelli what to do. Gelli's then telling what to do for that structure in Italy, the shadow government. And at one point, he basically controlled all of the banking structure, all of the power in Italy. So that's just one window into, and that included, as we said, I think at one point, 120 prelates. And this comes out in the European and Italian press in the 80s. Huge scandal. Oh, no, we've got 100.
I remember the front page article. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So what was going on? How were they doing this? Well, what they were doing was, and it was Paul Hellawell, who had, from the CIA, concocted this idea to, now that World War II is over, we got to fund all these black ops with something. We can't just ask people, Congress, hey, give us $1 billion for black ops. We're going to fund it off the books. We need liquid cash, like you pointed out in Shadow Masters. So he came up with this genius idea of, we'll just take over the old British and French intelligence models of running drugs, black markets, right? And Britain had done this with British intelligence in the Opium War with China, and French had done this with running various opium lanes prior
Well,
to
that was
that.
the whole thing of the Vietnam War. Because the
Yes,
French lost, the CIA won, and they started running drugs through
they
Wall
take
Street.
it over.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
exactly.
Golden circle, golden triangle. You talked about this in Shadow
Yeah,
Masters. That
yeah,
so
yeah.
this is what they do. That's part of Gladio in terms of the lanes, shipping lanes, networks. So they basically just create a whole list of shell companies, shell banks, shell front corporations. There's you could never keep up with all of them. There's so many of them. And then they interact and interconnect with one another to transfer the money, bounce the money all around so that it can't be tracked. And that then funds terrorism. It funds the Mujahideen. It funds CIA black operations. It funds coups in other countries. So that's essentially how it works. It's just international business that's off the records. That's black ops business. That's arms for drugs, arms for cash, whatever, and that's funding all the black operations. And that's the whole structure right there.
So you talked about P2, of course. Again, Lucio Gelli. I met him.
Wow.
Because I lived when Russia, because I worked in military counterintelligence for many years, and one of the reasons I wrote the Bilderberg book is when I left, I needed to eat, and I couldn't really, think of anything else I would do because I wouldn't work for a foreign government. So I thought to myself, we have lots of documents, meaning the Russian intelligence, on different private organizations such as the Bilderbergers, because you couldn't write a book like that without actually showing the pictures and the documents. And
right.
I was able to do that. And that's what people said, wow, maybe this is the real thing. And so I was working at the time in Italy, in Switzerland, in Lugano, when Russia had its consulate there, a military attaché. And Gelli, who was supposed to have been, this almost before he died, under house arrest in Italy, he was there. Who was he having a lunch with? With George Bush father.
There you go. Yeah.
In Lugano. So, of course, anyway, so P2 leader, Propaganda 2, Lucio Gelli, it was actually a project of Admiral William Canaris, who was the intelligence chief of the Imperial Navy and the German army during the National Socialism in Germany. He was one of these ringleaders of Operation Valkyrie against Hitler on 20th July 1944, which he was sentenced to death. And later, Canaris' secret projects were inherited by Reinhard Gehlen, especially his pet project to infiltrate the American political elites or the Italian-American mafia families such as the Lucianos, the Gambino, the Bonanos, etc. So this is a straight line leading from the mafia to the Knights of Malta, etc. You mentioned the drug trade, the mafia. Let's talk about that. I mean, this is a lot of fun. We can talk about this for hours, just roll with it. But Italian mafia, drug trade, World War II. Let's put this together into one.
Right. So the Navy originally had hatched an idea to reach out to various Italian mobsters because the Navy had, they were interested obviously in seaports, and they knew that the mobsters knew the logistics of seaports, and because they were importing and exporting various, black market types of things, stolen goods, drugs, whatever. So they reached out to Lucky Luciano, and he was one of the first recruits that the Navy had a direct operation and connection with.
Right.
This then kicks off a whole bunch of secret meetings and operations. Later on, the CIA then gets very involved in making these alliances with organized crime. And particularly, I think Vito Genovese at one point was a translator. So they needed people in Italy, in Sicily that could translate and, tell what's Mussolini up to and this kind of stuff. So there's a whole, actually more and more actually comes out about this over time. There's a book called Operation Underworld that covers this. It's really good. And then I think everybody probably knows that there's some degree of association with JFK and RFK's demise and organized crime, particularly when we get to the figures of Santos Trafficante. And Trafficante is a key figure for the CIA's role because he's the person that was chosen by the CIA to be the point man in Florida. He's the Florida mobster that runs basically that jurisdiction. And then you have in New Orleans, you have Carlos Marcello. But in Florida, it's Santos Trafficante, and he is the importer-exporter for Miami, these different areas where the boats come from Cuba, from different places, from Italy to bring in the goods, particularly heroin. So heroin becomes the big cash crop, the big money maker during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And that's when we start to get the takeover, as you said, of those lanes like the Golden Circle and the Golden Triangle. So this is why Vietnam was such an important. I mean, Vietnam's many things. Obviously, it's a lot of experiment with new technology, research and development. They experimented on drones for the first time in Vietnam. But key issue there, as you said, is the importation, exportation of heroin. And so they need the resources, as in the poppies and the cash crop. That's also what Afghanistan is about, obviously, right? And then we learn this as the U.S. invades Afghanistan under dubious pretexts post 9/11. Had nothing to do with Afghanistan, but yes, that's the mafia plays this key role of shipping, importing, exporting connections to other gangs where drugs can be distributed. That's the key role the mafia plays. The mafia can also provide intelligence. I mean, they do all kinds of things throughout this time period. But really, I was surprised getting into this topic in the last 4 years to the degree of cooperation that the CIA eventually achieved with organized crime. And like you said, you can go on and on and on. There's just
let me give you an example. So the head of the Luciano family from 1937 to 56 or 57 was Frank Costello. Mm-hmm. And both Canaris and Gellin, we're talking about the SS, worked with Costello. And so the Luciano family in 1957 was absorbed into the Genovese family. And in the 1940s, Vito Genovese worked with both the U.S. military intelligence and also German intelligence.
Okay.
And then there's another interesting fact that attorney for Frank Costello and the Genovese family was Edward Williams, who founded Williams and Connolly in 1967, just happened to be one of the leading law firms in the United States. And it's precisely at Williams and Connolly that Mike Pompeo began his career.
Oh, wow.
So that gives you and of course, then again, ties into Lucio Gelli. It becomes the face of P2, although above P2, there's P1, because P2 is P2, but P1 is above. Nobody talks about P1. And so you have Canaris and all these other characters with very close contacts with the Italian mafia. And then needless to say, then the Italian mafia and the Vatican, we have the Vatican scandal, we have Banco Rossiano, you have Calvio. But let's talk about that. How do these characters, because again, this takes us into the 1980s, because, Vatican is many different things, okay? Right. And I think religion and God and saving the soul, they're secondary of tertiary importance, don't you think?
That's what we ultimately come to find out, yeah. And I know because
it's not about faith,
right.
God and religious doctrine. I wish it was like that. It's about money, it's about power, it's about corruption. How corrupt are these people, do you think?
Extremely corrupt. I mean, I see the Vatican is just a bigger organized crime structure, basically. It's just another alternate form of organized crime. And I was, somebody who was very interested in Catholicism in my 20s. I took it very seriously and spent many, many years in that world. And, I think at a certain point you want to understand, well, why is there so much corruption? What's going on here? And this kind of takes you down this rabbit hole of looking into the geopolitics, the espionage, the power struggle side of it. And that's really what opens up the door to understanding what it really is, that it's really about power plays, it's about money, it's about corruption, it's about control. And that's, like you said, it's very unfortunate because it's not really that's obviously not what Jesus was talking about. I don't think he had an idea of an international bank 2,000 years ago, right?
He might have, but in any case, this rabbit's hole, people don't quite understand. A rabbit hole, it's not like a rabbit, there's a hole, we find a rabbit. It's this thing we go down, proverbial hole. We actually, when we start investigating, okay, you think, well, it's like, I'm almost there. Okay, I'm just going to turn the corner. It's all the answers. At least, most people think that's the case. It's like, and then you discover it, and then you realize there's this, there's this fork in the road.
There's two more doors.
And there's a million more doors. And you start investigating all these doors, and some people get further than others, but it's a perpetual, it's a never-ending thing. We mentioned the Roberto Calvi. Let's talk about that.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, I'm sorry. One element here that ties this to what you're talking about with this, the Odessa network, the Reinhard Galen org. This was an idea hatched also by the same figures where Dulles and these other characters, everybody's heard of Operation Paperclip, right? Well, this is also connected to that, because what do we do with these German intelligence networks, the Nazi intelligence networks post World War II? What do we do with this? Well, let's recruit them, bring them into things like NASA. Everybody's probably heard of Werner von Braun going to NASA. Well, it wasn't just that. It's also, we got to take over these German intelligence networks and fit them into the new emerging global structure. Well, how do we do that? Well, Galen is this key figure who the OSS CIA particularly used to set up and run and train new networks and new organizations and new black ops. And Galen becomes the founder of modern German intelligence. You get to the BND, it actually has its origins in the Galen organization. And by the way, for the people that are wondering what's going on in the Ukraine, how are there, tiny mustache men followers in Ukraine even today? It's actually this old Galen org network. So there's a direct connection between Galen organization and the training of the right sector, Pravi sector stuff in the Ukraine. So there's a direct line to that. Now, what about Calvi and these modern figures and all that? Well, if you go to the 80s, like you're talking about, when P2 and all this stuff gets exposed in the European press, and there's all this kind of government scandal in Italy and all this stuff, what we find out is that in the background, a lot of the figures who were in the Reagan administration were part of the far right Roman Catholic structure that you're talking about. So we get this figures like, and it goes back even to earlier with Vietnam with Colby. And it's not an accident that Colby goes from being stationed in Italy during the Gladio period to then running Phoenix program and the operations in Vietnam. If you read the Douglas Valentine book, which is really good on that. So Colby is an old school trad cat who had established those connections with Pius XII, and then he gets stationed in Vietnam, and then he becomes a CIA head. Then there's Alexander Haig. There is William Casey. There is a bunch of the structure under Reagan. These are all what you're talking about. These people who have an affinity for a connection to these fascist networks.
Well, you have people like Walter Rauf, who during World War II led the Nazi intelligence unit, is also responsible for the death of about 500,000 people in Auschwitz. And then after the war, Rauf was placed at the disposal of the Special Anglo-American Counterintelligence Group, led by whom? But the nutball, James Jesus Angleton himself.
Oh yeah, I forgot Angleton. Yeah.
His job was to save as many Nazis as possible from Allied persecution. And so you get you get Klaus Barbie, the butcher of the you get Franz Stengel, commander of the Treblinka death camps, etc. You got all these crazy, Adolf Eichmann, Joseph Mengele, etc., etc., etc.
And if I recall, Barbie goes to, is it Bolivia, Argentina?
Barbie goes to Bolivia, yeah.
And he makes deals with cartels, and that actually begins to help the CIA's drug running from
Latin America drug running operation, exactly.
Yeah, so you can see
and also don't forget Otto Skorzeny.
I was going to say Otto Skorzeny, yeah, he trains even people in Israel. So
not only in Israel, he trained people in Egypt. I mean, a lot of these Nazis after the war went to Egypt.
Yeah.
And so you have a Latin American military dictatorships. So they needed a lot of money. And since the 1950s, the level of debt with the International Monetary Fund, the American private bank, has increased several fold. And so the financial institutions were very happy to lend the money for the purchase of American czars, put down revolts. But all that was done, as you said, with the drug running operations. Yeah. And the collapse of P2 and Banco Ambrosiani coincided with a lot of these things, such as the Malvinas war. Hang on, we close the door, because they're building a house next door, and right now they come back from lunch. And so you have all this stuff, linked to the Malvinas war, et cetera, et cetera. But it's drugs, it's the Vatican Bank, it's the Pedui operation, it's the Nazis, it's Banco Ambrosiani, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and this is where we get the figure of Calvi, and this is the way that the operation is running in Italy, as you said, is this concocted shells within shells. They're like onion layers and onion rings of scam and fake banks that are set up. So they basically set up 8, 10, 20 different shell corporations. And at the center of this, or a big piece of this, is, as you said, Banco d'Ambrosiano and the Banco Milan and the Vatican Bank. And because the Vatican Bank is one of the world's most secretive banks, that's why you could see it would be chosen for these kinds of operations, because it's not supposed to be, it's not technically under the purview of the Italian government, right? It's its own city-state. And so that its own bank then could be, at least the reasoning went, it would be free from it. It would be out of the purview of oversight.
Right.
And that worked for a long time until, as we pointed out, a lot of this started leaking out in the media. So the key figure at this time was, as we said, Licio Gelli. I always just probably say it wrong, but he's the point man with Paul VI. So Paul VI is an important figure because he is this pope that essentially was really favored and chosen by the OSS and CIA. And there's a lot of theorizing that the OSS and CIA had a really key role in helping to get him chosen as pope. And we'll see the same thing, by the way, when we get to the figure of John Paul II. The CIA played a key role in helping to get John Paul II elected because they knew he would be a very important symbol to end the Cold War. But to get back to what you're talking about with Paul VI there and Calvi. So Paul VI is a key point man for the OSS and CIA, and he makes this important alliance with Gelli and Calvi and this guy named Archbishop Marcinkus, who is appointed to be to run the Institute of Religious Works, or what's called the Vatican Bank. And because Paul VI had been brought to power, he kind of had deals. He owed some things to people that helped him, particularly the OSS and CIA. And they said, look, we helped you in. We helped your predecessor with a lot of money coming into the Vatican Bank. We'll continue this operation with tens, hundreds, eventually becomes hundreds of millions of dollars by the time of John Paul II. This money will keep coming into the Vatican Bank, but you're going to help these operations. And hey, we're just helping to fight the communists in Latin and South America. So the money is really just going to fund the Contras and to fund this kind of stuff, right? And so of course Paul VI goes along with it. He's probably compromised. They're all compromised. So this is where we get this big scandal. Now, when you get giant fake banks and shell companies, a lot of people are taking money. A lot of people are stealing.
Obviously, yeah.
The organized crime figures are saying, well, hey, why don't we use this opportunity? And Marcinkus is part of this as well, even though he's an archbishop. They say, why don't we figure out a way to get our hands on the Italian pension money? And so they concoct this scheme to steal, I think, is either Bank of Italy or Bank of Milan, I forget which one it is, but to get their hands on everybody's pension money. And this ends up basically with $1.75 billion debt that collapses. The whole thing collapses. Vatican Bank, Banco d'Ambrosiano, it all collapses when all this stuff comes out. And now people are saying, okay, now we want our money, right? You don't take $1 billion, $2 billion from the mobsters and the CIA, and there's not hell to pay. So then we get figures that come in and say, maybe I can help you out. Now there's rumors that, I don't know how true this is, just speculations, that I think figures like David Rockefeller offered up a few $1 billion to help out, and he did this through Saudi liaisons, I think people say. So this could be one of the ways where there's a key element where the Western intelligence structure and the CIA and the British intelligence, et cetera, where they really start to have a total control over the Vatican. This is why we begin to see, in my view, this is my theory, more and more of the PEDO stuff coming out about people in the Vatican, because this compromise has been so entrenched, and it really comes to a head with Paul VI, and you see it particularly after Paul VI with John Paul I, who just merely mentioning investigations into the Vatican Bank corruption, he ends up poisoned, I would say, after 33 days of being a pope. He's poisoned.
You mentioned Paul Marcinkus. I don't know if you know this, but it turns out that he's the cousin of the nephew of Salvatore Luciano, which is the mobster Lucky Luciano, who in 1931 became the head of the American underworld.
No, I didn't know they were cousins. That makes sense, though. Yeah.
All this stuff we're talking about, really, like when you analyze the post-World War II structures, the key year for all of that is 1947, which is a kind of a pivotal year. I mean, World War II ended in 1945, September in Japan, 1945. But the year 1947 becomes a kind of a pivotal year in the post-war period. This was the year that the CIA was created. This is the year that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and the year that Winston Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, thus declaring the beginning of the Cold War. It's the year that U.S. Navy begins its Project Chatter, the search for a viable truth serum, a magic potion to unlock the secrets of the mind. It's the year that the greatest Satanist of the 20th century, Aleister Crowley, I'm going to ask you about him, died. And also, if we are to believe the Beatles, It's the year that Sergeant Pepper's band learned to play. It was also the year of the famous Roswell, New Mexico UFO crash, more or less, no? That meets the eye. You have extraterrestrials, you have spaceships, you have men in black, you have visitors from outer planets, you have the UFO phenomenon disembarking on the front pages of American newspapers. Okay, as we're seeing right now, so much shit happening at the same time. You don't know which way to run. I want to ask you a question. How about 5 minutes left? It's like, we've been at it for 40 minutes. It seems like we just started. So in an interview you gave, you were talking about Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page, being a fan of Crowley. Can we talk? I didn't know that. I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but I didn't know that. I mean, like, for example, Jim Morrison, I talked about in my book on Tavistock. He married his wife because these people are Satanists. In a satanic Wicca wedding, standing in a pentagram and drinking each other's blood. Right. This is pretty wild. And the back cover of the Doors album 13 shows the group gathered around a bust of Aleister Crowley. But tell me the story about Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page. I mean, Jimmy Page, this is a guy who is an astrophysicist. He's supposed to be a respected man. And he's a fan of Aleister Crowley, the main Satanist of the 20th century.
Yeah, I know the overview. I don't know a whole lot about
give us the overview.
Jimmy Page, but basically, yeah, he just, I think that 60s counterculture period, as you talked about in your Tavistock book, there's a darker element behind the 60s hippie love stuff. And that darker element, in my view, goes back to the Theosophy Society. They were really predicting and talking about the counterculture stuff, 60 years ahead of that, with Blavatsky, Bailey, Besant, all those figures, and including Crowley.
Right.
And another commonality that people overlook between Blavatsky and Besant and these characters and Crowley is connections to British intelligence.
Right.
And so, Dr. Richard Spence, we did an interview with him many years ago. He wrote a book called Secret Agent 666 about Crowley's role as an asset to British intelligence. So I think that's a key piece of the puzzle here to understand that, as we know, secret societies, they overlap with intelligence. And I think that with Jimmy Page, his fascination with the occult, and he owns a huge occult bookstore in England, and he bought Crowley's Boleskine Manor, overlooking Lake Loch Ness. I don't know if he still owns it, but he had bought it at one point, or if his family owns it or whatever. But I think that Led Zeppelin was just part of that atmosphere of the counterculture, but Page seems to have understood that it was more than this hippy dippy love stuff. It was actually, there's a satanic undercurrent, a core to the hippie stuff. And that's what you talked about in that. But the Doors are just one example, but there's actually plenty of examples of this when we get into the real figures that, in my view, were actually behind the promotion of the 60s counterculture. When you read Dr. Timothy Leary, I've read a lot of his books. When you read
that's some weird shit there.
Yeah, he's basically, if you go look at his book on Tibetan Book of the Dead, he's basically he's telling you how to be a shaman and be a mind controller. It's a technique for doing that. And a lot of these guys talked about he was a fan of Crowley. If you go look at Dr. John C. Lilly, he's a Luciferian when it comes to being a psychonaut. All these MK Ultra doctor connected people are into Crowley and Luciferianism. Absolutely.
But if you look at some of the secret societies, especially the British secret societies, because again, Crowley was British. We're talking about the Children of the Sun. We're talking about the Golden Dawn Order. And we're talking about some of the most famous people in the early part of the 20th century. Right. It was H.G. Wells who introduced Huxley, for example, Aldous Huxley, to Satanist Aleister Crowley. Crowley was, of course, a poster child of this, a cult that developed in Britain from the 1860s under the influence of Edward Bulwer Lytton, the colonial minister under Lord Palmerston during Second Opium War. And so all these people, Crowley, William Butler Yeats, poet and Nobel Prize winner, several other protege, formed this satanic, Isis Urania Temple of Hermetic Students of the Golden Dawn, which is the Isis cult, which was organized around the 1877 manuscript by, Isis unveiled by Madame Elena Blavatsky that you mentioned, in which the Russian occultists called for the British aristocracy to organize itself into this Isis priesthood. And then you have all these, T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, Sir Oswald Mosley, D.H. Lawrence, Huxley's lover, and let's not forget Prince of Wales himself would later become King Edward VIII. So all of these things that we're talking about, this is a rabbit hole, no, Jay?
No, you're right. I mean, all of that occult stuff is like you've been pointing out. Really, it's just another way of doing and running intelligence operations. It's another type of networking, you know.
Because
And
the
I mean,
Nazis want to be occult. I mean, Nazis were a sect.
yeah,
I mean, it's not a political party. It was a sect. They went to the occult.
right,
The
absolutely.
CIA, the American intelligence agencies. If you look at the symbols, okay, it's what you see and what you don't see, because most people don't understand. It's the images that we see on the subconscious level actually is what these people project, and when you actually start analyzing, and we can go back maybe in the next interview we can talk about John Dee, the Enochian magic, Queen Elizabeth I, all that stuff, which was amazingly interesting things. And if you don't know who John Dee is, talking to our audience, I very strongly suggest you look into it. This is the first original 007. You know, he actually signed all his papers 007, and that's where 007 comes from.
Right.
It has nothing to do with Ian Fleming, another member of a very wealthy aristocratic family. I actually visited his house in Jamaica.
Goldeneye.
They turned it into a hotel. I don't know if you've ever been there.
Yeah, it's called Goldeneye, right? Which is now
exactly. It's an amazing place. Amazing place. And there's certain areas you cannot go into, whatever it is that they have there. I mean, whether it's some kind of a hidden altar, I don't know. Anyway, Jay, it's been wonderful talking to you again. I mean, so much. We've basically touched on a lot of different things, but it's the idea of having all these pieces together. You building the structure, and that maybe before we're dead, we can figure out some of the things that we're talking about today, because there's so many rabbit holes to investigate and analyze. So before we go, I would like for you to tell us how can we follow your work, the books that you want us to read, and where we can buy them.
Yes, thank you. You can go to my website, jaysanalysis.com. You can find me on all the outlets, Twitter, YouTube, all those under my name. And I've got 2 books with Trine Day, same publisher that you've used. Esoteric Hollywood
is awesome. It's absolutely amazing. I read it 3 times. I have 2 copies, one in Toronto, one here.
Well, then we got there's a Esther Hollywood Part 2, which is a little different. First one's structured on symbolism of different directors. Part 2 is focused on films dealing with different themes. And then I'm working on Part 3 right now. So that'll be out maybe in the next 6 months to a year, perhaps. But then I've got other books on philosophy and geopolitics and stuff. You could get that at my shop and my website. But yeah, so that's where you
can you tell us your website again, please?
jaysanalysis.com.
jaysanalysis.com. Got it. Jay, thanks so much for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate it.
Take care. Bye.
Have a good day.